So what is good for Johnson & Johnson is therefore very good for the Johnson Foundation. And what's good for the Johnson Foundation is good for Johnson & Johnson. And what could be better for a seller of nicotine drugs than smoking bans, the demonisation of the tobacco industry, and higher cigarette prices? And these are the main policies that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's tobacco control programme is aimed towards. In 1991, the US government approved the sale of nicotine patches on prescription. And it was in 1991 that the Johnson Foundation began funding anti-smoking projects. Since that time, it has given $450 million to anti-smoking projects, including, and these are just a few of them, $84 million to the Centre for Tobacco-Free Kids, $10 million towards a campaign to raise the price of cigarettes, and $99 million to the Smokeless States Initiative. The only other suppliers of so-called nicotine replacement drugs are Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline. And while the Johnson Foundation's activities are largely confined to the United States, Glaxo and Pfizer are more focused on making tobacco control a truly global affair. So by the end of the 90s, both Glaxo and Pfizer were fully paid-up members of the World Health Organization's Tobacco-Free Initiative. Glaxo and Pfizer helped finance the Smoke-Free Europe Conference. They part-funded the Institute for Global Tobacco Control. In the UK, they fund the Roy Castle Foundation. When the 11th World Conference of Tobacco came to Chicago in the year 2000, the Johnson Foundation paid $4 million.
That was good.
When the 11th World Conference on Tobacco came to Chicago in the year 2000, it was the Johnson Foundation that paid $4 million to be one of the hosts. And GlaxoSmithKline was a patron of the event. And the Pfizer Foundation, because they have their own foundation as well, has recently donated $33 million to an assortment of anti-smoking groups, including the newly formed ASH International. And it really goes on, and there's no point in going through all these multi-million-dollar grants. But it doesn't take a genius to work out what the motivation of these companies is for their extraordinary generosity. Already by the end of the 90s, Nicorette and Nicoderm were selling to the tune of $570 million a year. By 2007, Chantix alone was making $883 million. And although these sums are enormous, they really are nothing compared to what they will be if the rest of the world takes on the kind of anti-smoking policies that we see in America and in Europe. Now, if you're cynical, you might say that the interests of the pharmaceutical companies and the professional anti-smoking advocates would not be best served by prohibition. Because prohibition would firstly put the anti-smokers out of a job, and within a few years there will be no need for the nicotine products that are supposed to wean people off nicotine addiction. And if you are very cynical, you might say that actually the best case scenario for both these parties would be a situation in which nicotine is being removed from cigarettes and the pharmaceutical industry is the only legal purveyor of them. And remarkably, that is exactly the scenario put forward by tobacco control advocates. In 2005, the flagship Tobacco Control Journal published an article called "Toward a Comprehensive Long-Term Nicotine Policy." And it was a really very rare example of the movement spelling out its ultimate goal. Generally, it prefers to fight one battle at a time and never scare off more moderately minded people by saying that the ultimate goal is really a form of prohibition. But in this article, they set out short-term, medium-term, and long-term policies. The short-term policy, said the authors, is the immediate need is to capture all nicotine into a regulatory system. Now, the importance of this is that it allows the government to reduce nicotine levels in cigarettes, and ultimately they could reduce the nicotine levels to zero. And indeed, that is exactly what the Centre for Tobacco-Free Kids in America is currently petitioning for. The authors then go on to say that pharmaceutical nicotine should be made more available at cheaper prices. You should be able to buy it from vending machines, while at the same time, the number of places you can buy cigarettes and packed tobacco and so on should be obviously reduced. The hours that you can buy them should be reduced, and the prices should be brought with no end in sight to how high they could go. Then they go on to say and this is the important bit really, they say the ready availability of clean nicotine would also allow addicted smokers who do not obtain adequate nicotine from their reduced nicotine cigarettes to supplement their nicotine intake. So this is a policy which would leave the pharmaceutical companies as the sole legal sellers of nicotine. Smokers would still be able to purchase the cigarettes, and because they can still buy them, the anti-smoking lobby would still be able to take the taxes from them. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical company would have its pockets lined by smokers who are having to take both. Of course, I should say what the long-term goal is. It won't be a great surprise to you. It is the virtual elimination of tobacco use as it is presently known. So that's what the tobacco control enterprise and the pharmaceutical companies are hoping to achieve together, and they certainly have the cash with which to campaign for it. So where does this embarrassment of riches leave the grassroots anti-smoking group? The simple answer is they really barely exist at all. The tobacco control movement continues to portray itself as a David fighting a Goliath. But if that was ever a true analogy, it is certainly not the case today. There was a time, in the 80s, when the tobacco industry would create front groups to campaign against anti-smoking proposals. Creating fake grassroots groups is something known as astroturfing. And astroturfing has now been adopted as standard practice by the anti-smoking movement around the world. For example, when a bill to ban smoking in public places was put before the electorate in Texas, it was the American Cancer Society that resorted to manufacturing not one, but two so-called grassroots groups to masquerade as the voice of the people. In Britain, regional anti-smoking groups like DMIST and Smoke Free Action are entirely funded by the Department of Health. England's branch of ASH was created by the government, and it currently derives less than 3% of its funding from voluntary donations. It has no volunteers, nor does ASH Scotland or ASH Wales, both of whom are overwhelmingly funded by the state, with additional funds coming from Pfizer Foundation. And those old activists of the 70s are certainly not impoverished anymore. The British version of Gatsby is no longer even a charity. Some time ago it became a limited company and now makes its money selling no smoking signs and smoke-free paraphernalia. James Repace has long since left the EPA and now does very well as a self-employed second-hand smoke consultant for his own company, Repace Associates. Both he and Stanton Glantz have both been personally given $300,000 each as winners of the Johnson Foundation's Innovators Award. Simon Chapman, who was once a prominent member of the Australian anti-smoking group Brother Up, is now the editor of Tobacco Control magazine, and John Banzhaf continues to draw a $200,000 salary as a director of ASH when he isn't suing people for suing restaurants for making people fat.